Welcome back to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we're going to explore the tragic deaths of two young women in Dundee, Scotland. The murders shared many similar features and over the years have often been linked together. Carol Lannen was just 18 years old and Elizabeth McCabe was 20 when their lives were sadly taken away from them. Their deaths began to be collectively known as the Templeton Woods Murders, and they have baffled investigators ever since. This episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. Dundee is Scotland's fourth largest city and is located in the eastern central lowlands of the country. Its proximity on the north bank of the Firth of Tay has meant that over the years the city has become an important trading port, particularly during the Industrial Revolution. Today it is a modern city, employing many people from the local areas and housing a large number of students due to the two universities located there. During the 1960s and 70s, Dundee was where Carol Lannen called home. Carol had not had an easy upbringing. It's reported in the Scottish Daily Mail that she had had a rocky childhood. She was the youngest of 5 siblings, and her family life was not consistent, with her father being imprisoned before she was 10 years old. Due to the issues at home, Carol would find herself in care for a time. She attended St John's Roman Catholic Secondary School in Dundee, but her school life was not much easier. It's reported in the same article from the Mail that one of her classmates described her, saying, "We used to feel sorry for her. She didn't have a circle of friends, not even one close friend. People would try and get her involved, but it didn't work. It was difficult to talk to her one-on-one. I don't think she had a happy home life. She never looked a happy teenager. She always looked haunted. All through school I never saw her smile once." This description of what Carol was like during her school life is of course subjective and will not be the whole picture. However, it was evident that events in her life may have had an effect on her personality and her decisions. During the late 1970s, police have stated that it was thought that Carol had begun to get involved with sex work and would frequent the Exchange Street and Castle Street areas of Dundee, which were known as the Red Light District. In December 1978, Carol had a baby boy, and it's reported in the newspapers at the time that Carol continued to juggle new motherhood and sex work to try and make ends meet. This is something that Carol's family would later deny. However, if this was the case, then this would have been an awful struggle for an 18-year-old. This was the way that her life was until an awful discovery would completely devastate Carol's family and those that knew her. On March 21, 1979, a couple were out walking in the Templeton Woods area of Dundee. Templeton Woods is located around a 15-minute car journey and just under 5 miles outside of the city centre. It's an area which is today looked after by the Woodland Trust and a place that many people enjoy walking in. During the 1970s, while also a place for walkers, it was known as an area used by sex workers and courting couples. Snow had covered the ground on the 21st of March, and as the couple were walking along close to the golf club, they suddenly came across something unexpected. On the ground, partially covered in snow, they found a woman's naked body. The couple immediately contacted police, who made their way out to the area. It was clear that they had a crime scene and that this woman had been murdered. She was completely naked and there was no sign of her clothing or any of her belongings at the scene where she was found. The police were able to confirm the woman's identity relatively quickly after discovering her body. She was 18-year-old Carol Lannen. While police did not immediately release information about her cause of death, it was later established that she had been strangled. But how had Carol ended up at Templeton Woods, and where were all of her belongings and clothing? The killer had evidently murdered Carol and taken all of her things with them. The question was Carol killed in Templeton Woods, or did they have a second crime scene they needed to discover? The police quickly got to work trying to track down Carol's movements in the hours and days before her murder, to see if this could point them in the right direction. The red light district was immediately a focus for the investigation, as it was known that this is where Carol spent some time. Investigators began canvassing the area and looking for any witnesses who may have seen Carol before she was killed. The police gained several registration numbers of men that had been curb crawling in the area in the days before the discovery of Carol's body. It's reported in the Aberdeen Press and Journal just 2 days after the recovery of her body that a police spokesman told the public, "We have the car numbers and descriptions. To avoid possible embarrassment to them, we would like these men to come forward." The theory was that someone must have picked Carol up in a car in order to take her the 5-mile journey outside of the city centre. Police also reached out to sex workers in the area in the hope that they would have information about people who they saw or knew in the area that could have been involved. Chief CID Superintendent for Tayside CID, James Cameron, asked workers in the Exchange Street area to come forward and give information about the cars they may have got in on the Tuesday evening, the 20th of March, the day before Carol's body was found. He stated, "I am particularly interested in hearing from prostitutes who were working in the Exchange Street/Dock Street area on Tuesday evening in order to establish which cars they went in that night, with a view to eliminating these vehicles from the host of information we have obtained. Anyone who comes forward and any information will be treated in confidence." He also advised sex workers in the area to refrain from their trade, saying, "If they fail to do so, they should stick to their established clients. For their own protection, if they're working on the streets, they should work in pairs." The police were clearly worried for the safety of other women working in the area, and Carol's murder had made the public concerned about what this perpetrator may do next. Carol's murder had been so brutal and brazen that people were deeply disturbed by it. Detectives continued to try and track down any leads in the subsequent days, including releasing information about a woman that was seen with Carol on that Tuesday night. This woman was believed to be one of Carol's friends, and was described as being around 18 years old, around 5 feet with a heavy build and a round face. She had fair hair worn in an afro style, and was wearing a purple cape-type coat. It was hoped that this woman may have information about Carol's whereabouts that night. Investigators also released information about what they believed Carol had been wearing when she left home that night around 7 p.m. It's reported in the Aberdeen Press and Journal that she had been wearing a white polo neck sweater, a brownish mid-length striped shirt with a matching tie belt, black medium-high lacing shoes with metal toe caps, and a black velvet jacket. She also had a black leather handbag with a zip on the top, 2 pockets on the side, and shoulder straps. Despite the appeals by the police and the positive response by the public, finding any new evidence for what happened to Carol proved difficult. Carol's family also had to come to terms with losing their daughter, and on the 31st of March, 10 days after her discovery, her body was laid to rest. Her mother and her stepfather issued a statement to the public about their daughter's death, saying that they hoped she would not be misjudged. A spokesman for the family stated, "The family have been deeply distressed at the rumours that have been circulating since Carol's death. They wish to vigorously deny the imputation that she was involved in prostitution or any other criminal activity." Carol's family went on to explain that she had been in a relationship with her baby's father, who was her boyfriend, and that she had wished to marry him. They also appealed for anyone with any information to come forward to police, but stated that they hope Carol could now be laid to rest without an unjustified smear on her character. Her family were clearly very distressed by her death and were upset by the way that Carol had been portrayed in the newspapers at the time. The police, however, continued to seek information from the red light district of Dundee, and it was later reported that this continued canvassing may have finally thrown up a witness who saw Carol on that Tuesday night. It's reported that she had last been seen at the junction of Commercial Street and Exchange Street. She was seen getting into a red estate car which was thought to be a Ford. Police issued an appeal for the owner of this car to contact them so they could be eliminated from their inquiries. However, nobody came forward to say that it was them. This was of course suspicious and definitely something that the police were interested in pursuing further. A description of the man was also issued to the public along with a photo fit. He is described as being between 25 and 30 years old, of a thin build, pale complexion, and with short dark hair and short sideburns. He was clean-shaven but had a moustache that looked as though it needed trimming. Detectives had also been trying to track down Carol's clothing and her belongings in the hope that they may lead to the killer. 11 days after Carol's body was found, another discovery was made. On the 1st of April 1979, people had gathered at the River Don in Aberdeenshire to take part in a charity raft race. It's reported that a young girl who was in attendance noticed a black handbag which had been washed up on the riverbanks. She went to retrieve it and noticed there was also some clothes there as well. There was a woman's polo neck jumper, tights and a belt. Inside the bag there was a purse with money in and a child allowance book. This was a strange discovery, and the young girl later gave the items to an off-duty police officer who was also there for the charity race. He dropped them in at a local police station on his way home. This discovery later got back to Tayside Police, who immediately understood the importance of it. The clothes and handbag matched the description of what Carol was known to have been wearing at the time she left home on that Tuesday evening. The items would later be confirmed as belonging to her. The discovery also threw up some more questions. The area in which they were found is located around 85 miles from where Carol had been discovered. How had they got there, and when were they dumped? The area was around a 2-hour drive away, and while it was known that the killer must have used a car, had they then driven to dispose of the evidence? This was certainly a puzzling part of the case, and suggested that the perpetrator was eager to remove any connection to Carol. Over the next few weeks and months, it's reported that the police spoke to over 7,000 people in relation to the murder. However, none of these leads appeared to relate to the case. Despite the amount of resources that had been put into the investigation, the police hit a brick wall. The leads began to dry up, and Carol's case became cold during 1979. The case remained unsolved and continued to be a mystery. However, almost a year later, in February 1980, another horrific discovery was made. On the 25th of February, another woman's body was found in Templeton Woods. This woman was found partially clothed and was later found to have been strangled. Another alarming part was that her body was found only 150 yards from where Carol Lannen had been found 11 months before. The fact that this woman had been killed in a similar way and also been left partially naked in Templeton Woods raised several red flags for Tayside CID, who were concerned that yet another woman had been murdered in the same area. Like Carol, this woman was left without her belongings or much of her clothing. When the police looked into her identity, they quickly became aware of a missing person investigation that was also going on at the time. An investigation had already been launched into the disappearance of 20-year-old Elizabeth McCabe, who had gone missing 15 days before the body had been discovered. Sadly, when the woman's identity was checked against Elizabeth's, they got a match. Elizabeth had finally been found, but not in the circumstances that anyone would have hoped. She had been reported missing on February the 12th by her parents after failing to return home on the evening of the 11th. Elizabeth lived at Lyndhurst Drive, just outside the city centre, with her parents Jim and Anne. She worked as a nurse at a city centre nursery school and was described as shy and close to her family. She was also attending college to improve her qualifications. On February the 11th, Elizabeth decided to go on a night out in Dundee with her friend Sandra, who also worked at the same nursery school. The pair went to Teaser's nightclub in Union Street in the city centre, and Sandra would later explain in 2007 that this was the last place that she saw Elizabeth. She told Surrey Live that she had gone to get her coat after the lights went up to indicate that it was time to leave. She agreed to meet Elizabeth outside the club as she had already retrieved her coat from the cloakroom. Sandra waited outside the club as arranged, but was surprised that she couldn't see Elizabeth. She went back in and looked for her inside the club, and also checked at the local taxi rank, but couldn't find her anywhere. Sandra explained, "It was crowded, I looked up and down the street. I assumed she had gone home." Sandra then decided to go home with a former boyfriend that she had been dancing with that night, but added they would have given Elizabeth a lift home if they had found her. The next day, Sandra went to work as usual, but hadn't expected to see Elizabeth there, as she was at college that day. When she got home, however, she stated she thought it was odd that Elizabeth hadn't left a message for her. Sandra then contacted Elizabeth's house and spoke to her parents. She was told that Elizabeth wasn't there and hadn't been home all night. Sandra stated, "I was surprised that she wasn't there, that she hadn't been home all night. I didn't know what to think. I felt guilty. I think her parents had assumed she was with me." It was at this point that Elizabeth's parents decided to contact police to report her missing. Police began a missing person investigation over the next 2 weeks, however nothing relevant was discovered until they found Elizabeth's body. The police knew that she had last been seen at around 12:30 in the early hours of February the 12th, and they believed that Elizabeth's body had been in the woods for some time before it was discovered. Investigators were eager to find out anything else about that evening, and like in Carol's case, they were anxious to track down anyone that had been seen in the area. It was known that Elizabeth and Sandra had first been to the Junction 9 disco before moving on to Teaser's nightclub. Sandra provided more information explaining that Elizabeth had been upset during the night out. She explained that she had spent some of the night crying in the toilet, telling Sandra that nobody liked her. Sandra said she told her they could go home, and that Elizabeth appeared to cheer up a little bit after this. This was not long before the girls decided to leave, and when the lights came up, Sandra said that Elizabeth already had her coat with her, and the pair agreed that they would share a taxi. This was important information as it gave some insight as to how Elizabeth was feeling that evening, and indicated that the pair had had a conversation about getting a taxi together. The fact that Elizabeth may have got into a taxi was a crucial lead for police, who began investigating all taxi drivers in the area at the time. Police were also following up another line of inquiry. While Elizabeth had been found with some of her clothes, items including her shoes, handbag and gloves were still missing. In April 1976, the handbag was finally located on a piece of waste ground on Cobden Street in Dundee. The bag looked to have been there for a while before it was discovered. Chief Superintendent James Cameron, who was also looking into Elizabeth's murder, explained at the time that he wanted to eliminate any innocent people who may have touched the bag while it was on the waste ground. He confirmed that it was being forensically tested. Some other items of Elizabeth's clothing was also found around a mile away from her body, thrown over a wall near a bus stop. It appeared that whoever was dumping the clothing was doing so en route, or in random places away from the scene. The question of whether Carol and Elizabeth's murders could indeed be linked was being speculated upon by the public and the newspapers. It seemed as though there were similarities that could not be ignored. James Cameron told the public, "I am obviously looking at both murders together and endeavouring to keep an open mind on each. There are similarities." He later confirmed that police were working in the same office so they could cross-check information for both cases. In March 1980, Elizabeth's funeral took place with 200 people reportedly in attendance. Elizabeth's family were devastated by what had happened to their eldest child, and her father broke down at the funeral. Police were determined to do anything they could to try and solve the case, however many of the leads that they had seemed to come up empty. The hypothesis from the beginning of the case was that Elizabeth must have got a lift outside the club, but they were yet to find any concrete evidence to support this. They interviewed around 700 taxi drivers in the area, however had not found anything conclusive. Local hotelier and counsellor May Barrowman also launched a campaign to find who had killed Elizabeth, and put up a reward of £5,000. Despite this reward and the thorough investigation, the case still went cold. The years passed in both Carol and Elizabeth's cases without much more being discovered. However, in the early 2000s, police began to consider using new forensic techniques to retest evidence that they already had stored. Detectives launched a cold case review in 2004 and tested evidence that they had. This retesting did yield some important developments that led to an arrest being made in 2005 in Elizabeth's case. It was announced that a taxi driver named Vincent Simpson had been arrested for her murder. He ran a private hire taxi company near Dundee at the time of the murder and was spoken to during the original investigation. The evidence against him appeared to hinge on some forensic evidence that had been found on a blue jumper from the scene. There was also a hair root that had been matched to Simpson. Simpson pleaded not guilty and claimed his innocence in the crime from the beginning. At trial, Simpson's defence team cast doubt upon the DNA evidence, stating that it had been mishandled and stored incorrectly during the time that had elapsed. It's reported in the Courier newspaper that a bag of evidence was thought to have been stored with evidence from Carol Lannen's murder. There was also thought to be missing items, including samples from Elizabeth's body. Simpson's defence team also brought up several other alternate suspects. A list of 13 was presented. One of the people on the list who testified during the trial was Brian Lindsay. Lindsay had admitted to having a one-night stand with Elizabeth and had been spoken to by the police 18 times during the original investigation. It's reported by the Herald newspaper that at one point he even accused police of trying to fit him up for the murder. At trial, it was stated that Lindsay also had a violent past and had been looking for sex that night in Dundee. He told the court, "I knew one day I would get into court and prove my innocence. I didn't murder that lassie. There is no way I murdered that lassie. They have not found any of my forensics on the lassie's body." Vincent Simpson claimed he had an alibi for that night, and therefore he could also have nothing to do with it. After 7 weeks of evidence, the jury were sent to deliberate, and they later returned a verdict of not guilty. Simpson reportedly replied to the judge, "Thank you very much." The jury had been convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that Simpson had not been the person involved with Elizabeth's murder. The reinvestigation had still not found the killers of Carol or Elizabeth, and sadly had not brought any closure to their families. Over the years, there has been much speculation about what happened to them. Some of the theories have included the Yorkshire Ripper Peter Sutcliffe, or the killer Angus Sinclair, who carried out the World's End pub murders of Christine Eady and Heather Scott in 1977. There was even a tip that the Zodiac Killer, a serial killer who was active in the California area during the 1960s and 70s, may have been involved in the murders. This is a theory that was quickly ruled out, however, by investigators in California. It's reported in an article by the Evening Telegraph in 2019 that Sandy McGregor, a journalist who wrote about the cases in his book The Law Killers, believes that a former social worker called Andrew Hunter may be involved. Hunter was convicted of murdering his wife by strangling her in some woods in Fife in 1988. He states, "During his trial, it emerged Hunter was trawling the city centre for prostitutes. The photo fit of the Templeton Woods murder suspect bore a striking resemblance to him." Thanks to the passage of time, no one except the person or persons who took the last breath of life from two defenceless women is likely ever to know for sure if they were sisters in death or just strangers whose resting place simply happened to be 150 yards apart. It is of course just speculation that Andrew Hunter had anything at all to do with the murders of Carol and Elizabeth. The question of whether these two murders are in any way connected still remains one of the biggest mysteries of these cases. There were several similar features to both crimes. Both women were young and around the same age and were taken from Dundee city centre in the evening. They were left in the same area and they were both naked or partially clothed. They had both been strangled and their clothing and belongings had been dumped at various different places, Carol's being taken much further away. In particular, their handbags were specifically left out in the open, with nothing being taken out of them. It was clear that they were both taken by someone with a car who could transport them to the area and then travel to dump the clothing and belongings. Some people have pointed out that there was a possible difference between Carol and Elizabeth in terms of victimology. Police believe that Carol had been in the red light district and working as a sex worker when she was taken and killed. This would mean that whoever took Carol may have been looking for a sex worker in the area. Elizabeth was taken from outside a club, and police were looking for a suspect who may have been working as a taxi driver. This implies perhaps two different suspects. Carol's family do not believe she was working as a sex worker, and if they were correct, then could police have been looking in the wrong place for her killer? The fact that they were both found in the same area of Templeton Woods suggested that either the killer or killers were familiar with that area and would know that they could leave the body without being seen. Chief Superintendent James Cameron, who led the investigations at the time, commented on the case just this year in an article in the Courier newspaper, saying, "I have an open mind about who killed Carol and Elizabeth. We interviewed thousands of people and could have interviewed the killer. I don't honestly know. He simply slipped the net." He also added that there were many similarities between the murders and that they had to consider that there was a serial killer on the loose. Police Scotland have also commented on the two cases, stating, "All cold cases are regularly reviewed in conjunction with the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal Service. We understand that losing a loved one in any circumstances, particularly when a crime has taken place, is extremely distressing, and we can provide reassurance that any new information which is received will be investigated thoroughly." A spokesman for the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal said that unresolved homicides always remained open and that new information would always be considered. Carol's son Derek has also spoken to the press about how her death has impacted on him and their family. In an article for the Daily Record, Derek opened up about his experience, explaining that he was brought up by his grandmother, and when she died in 2011, he felt like he had lost two mums. He stated, "My life with my gran and my sisters was normal. I didn't know much as my family were careful about talking about it when I was a kid. They wanted to protect me from it, but kids at school would say things and tell me my mum was murdered in the woods and was a prostitute. Kids can be cruel." He also added, "We've had our hopes raised so many times that the police would get a result. With the advances in DNA and forensics, we thought there would be a result, but it wasn't to be." He said he felt like his mother had somehow been reduced to just a name in the newspaper as a murder victim and a prostitute. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend with a personality and a life, and it was taken away from her in the most violent circumstances. Whatever her lifestyle, she didn't deserve that, and neither did her family. We've all suffered in our own ways with her death. The person who killed her destroyed her family too. I just hope someone comes forward and gives the police something they can work with. It's time to let Carol and my mum rest in peace. They both deserve that." This is such a powerful statement and really shows how cold cases can affect family members and generations. It's so important that we remember that Carol and Elizabeth were important members of their own families, and that their deaths are still affecting people today. I really do hope that the police find some new information in these cases and can hopefully give the families the justice and closure that they deserve. Thanks for listening to this episode. As always, I want to thank everyone who continues to support the podcast in so many different ways. Thanks to our Patreon supporters. If you're interested in supporting us on there to receive early access episodes, bonus episodes, stickers and shoutouts, use the link in the show notes. Thanks to everyone who has been leaving us reviews recently. I appreciate it and they always make my day. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube where we have a channel. I upload the audio from the episodes, so subscribing would also help massively. If you have any suggestions for cases, please let me know on social media or at my email address, theunseenpod@gmail.com. As always, I'm Caprice and this has been Unseen.